The first time I saw it move, I did not focus on the tentacles. I fixated on the pupils, because there were too many. They rotated and contracted like a bundle of camera irises trying to agree on one exposure, then snapped into a single, normal eye for a heartbeat, as if the thing had rehearsed what a human expects to see and was mocking me with it. That instant was when Trypanohyncha Ocellus, the parasitic eye from alien Earth, stopped being a monster and became a system in my mind, a machine with rules I could study, an organism with a vision strategy that lets it take you over through your most vulnerable interface to the world. The show gives it a clinical label, Species 64, and a nickname, the Eye, but the behaviour is what burned into me. It rips out your eye, seats itself in your socket, mates its optic pathways to your brain, and puppeteers everything you used to call you. What I want to unpack here, in plain first person, is how that eye actually seems to work, what the formation of those multiple irises might mean, how it apparently chooses hosts, why it feels intelligent rather than merely reactive, where it might have come from, and what that implies for anyone unlucky enough to be in its field of view. I am going to stay grounded in what the show depicts and what creators and coverage have confirmed, and I will flag where I am hypothesizing from biology or from the on-screen evidence rather than reciting canon. Let's begin. What the show tells us straight. Let me lay down the facts the series and surrounding coverage have established. Trypanohyncha Ocellus is catalogued aboard the Weyland-Yutani exploratory vessel USCSS Maginot during a decades-long mission. After the Maginot's catastrophic crash in Prodigy City, New Siam, the eye escapes containment. We see it animate the corpse of the ship's cat, Rascal, and later attempt to transfer to a more capable living host. The creature's modus operandi is to eject a target's eyeball, occupy the socket, interface with the optic nerves, and override motor control. Even before it secures a permanent host, it travels with unsettling agility on octopus-like tentacles. It is not mindless. Notes attributed to the Maginot science team describe it as demonstrating remarkable problem-solving skills at near-human measure, which tracks with its on-screen tactics. Those are the anchor points. From that base, I can reason about the details of the eye itself and the strategies it uses. The architecture of a weaponized eye. When I freeze frame my memory of the eye, what jumps out is the concentric swarm of irises. The surface looks like a glossy sclera with several dark, living apertures that dilate independently, then concertina toward a dominant front pupil. That behavior suggests a multi-aperture sensor, not a simple camera eye. It is as if the creature has layered ocelli that can act alone or fuse functionally to give a single composite image. When outlets describe multiple pupils and irises that wrap around the circumference, I read that as coverage of a ring of adjustable apertures, each feeding a distributed retina or retinal mosaic. In practical terms, that would let the eye do three things at once. It can scan a wider field without moving the head, it can run split exposure to handle brutal contrast in low light and glare, and it can rapidly align one aperture with the host's gaze when it is seated in the socket, so that to outside observers, it looks like an ordinary pupil. The creature is not growing a new human eye, it is choosing which of its own pupils gets to play the role. Here is why that matters. You cannot puppet a complex host well if you are blind to what they are trying to do. Fine motor control needs immediate, high-fidelity feedback. Multiple irises give redundancy and speed. Even if one aperture is blocked with fluid or debris, another can take over with near-zero lag. And because these irises ride on a body covered in flexible muscle and tentacle roots, the eye can micro-adjust the angle of incidence to cheat the limits of the host's bony orbit. If you have ever tried to look up with a stiff neck, you know how costly those constraints can be. The eye negates them with sub-socket articulation that a standard eye simply does not have. Biologically, a multi-iris design is not as far-fetched as it first feels. Invertebrates use simple eyes called ocelli for fast light detection and horizon stabilization, while other designs pack photoreceptors into unusual geometries to trade acuity for speed. The eye looks like a predator that kept the speed and added enough resolution to coordinate a full-bodied takeover. That is why the animation of the irises made me think of exposure, compensation, and not just menace. This is a creature solving a vision problem in real time. becoming the host's eye. One detail in the franchise's ancillary descriptions that has stuck with me is the claim that once Trypanohyncha Ocellus is in the socket, it can alter its appearance to resemble the host's eye, with its multiple irises appearing to combine into a single iris. At first glance, that reads like camouflage to avoid detection by allies. But it is even more sinister when you consider the social side of human vision. So much of our empathy and trust passing happens through eye contact. If the eye can approximate the host's original iris, colour, ring texture, even a hint of scleral veins, then it buys precious seconds before anyone realises something is wrong. Seconds are all it needs to close distance or manipulate a door panel. I keep returning to this because it implies the creature is not just hiding, it is exploiting a deep social affordance. Mechanically, that apparent combining could be an illusion produced by shutting down peripheral apertures while leaving a central iris open and perhaps swelling a pigmented membrane behind it to colour match. Cephalopods in our world can alter skin patterns rapidly. The eye feels like a neuromuscular analogue inside the orbital cavity. If it can vary pigment density and iris margin with millimetre precision, it can fake the look of a human pupil at the exact moment someone checks your face for recognition. The interface that steals you. Taking over an organism through the orbit is a ruthless piece of engineering. The orbit is a crowded tunnel of anatomical roots. You have the optic nerve, the ocular motor system, and a vascular network that feeds the retina and the extraocular muscles. If the eye can physically dock to that braid, plugging into the optic nerve for sensory input and the ocular motor pathways for motor command, and perhaps leaching blood supply from the ophthalmic artery, it gets a privileged, low-latency interface to the brainstem and the cerebrum. You do not need to penetrate the spinal column when vision is already directly wired into the central nervous system. The show signals that connection clearly when the eye pushes aside the biological eye, seats itself, and then the host's body starts moving like a marionette's under a confident hand. Journalistic coverage has been consistent on this point. It rips the eye, embeds in the socket, and usurps control. The elegant part, from the parasite's point of view, is that it uses the highways the body already built. It does not need to drill new pathways when the brain will happily route commands along cranial nerves once the right signals are present. That is why watching it animate the cat first and later work on larger hosts disturbed me more than a facehugger ever did. The mouth has defences. We expect gags, bites, choking reflexes. The eye is where we accept light and truth. If something rewires that, it is not just taking your hands and legs, it is spoofing the very feed that tells you what is real, how it moves, and why that matters. Outside a host, the eye moves with a slithering efficiency on its tentacles, which the show and articles liken to octopus limbs. That is not window dressing. If I imagine what this means in a lab, a creature with multiple suckered appendages can exploit every surface for traction. It can accelerate laterally, leap by contracting several limbs at once, and anchor 2 or 3 while reaching with the others. That is perfect for crossing the slick, chaotic plating of a failing ship or the smooth tile of an industrial lab. It also means that while your instinct is to kick a charging object away, you are underestimating its low center of mass and the fact that it can change direction mid-sprint. Everything about those tentacles makes the eye a better delivery package for the payload that lives at its center, the iris cluster meant for your orbit. Host choice is not random. I keep replaying its transfer behaviour. After the crash, it animated Rascal the cat. When more suitable hosts presented themselves, it tried to move. Later, it demonstrates control over a sheep, even forcing it up on hind legs for balance. None of that feels like rolling dice. It looks like a ranking algorithm that prioritises hosts by mobility, mass, access, and the speed with which insertion can be achieved. A small, already dead animal is a stopgap. A living bipedal being with unobstructed eyes is the main course. The sheep sequence reads like a test run, a way to check leverage and proprioception in a quadruped before attempting a higher value target in the same environment. Coverage has noted both the cat incident and the ovine possession, which suggests the writers deliberately showed us a transfer ladder so we could infer the creature's decision process. If I push that idea further, I would say the eye is choosing hosts the way a seasoned climber chooses holds. It is mapping routes. The top priorities seem to be mechanical access to the orbit and a reasonable expectation of control payout once seated. A heavily armoured face, a visor, or a visor with anti-intrusion seals would force it to expend energy and time on ingress. A host with compromised neural function or too small a body would give a poor return, so it grabs what it can grab fast, then upgrades. There is also a chilling social layer to its selection. When it impersonates a normal eye well enough to pass a glance test, a humanoid host becomes a vector, not just for locomotion, but for infiltration. The eye could pilot that person through crew-only doors, bluff its way close to a group, and create panic when the ruse breaks. That makes bipedal, communicative species an even higher priority. Intelligence you can feel on screen. I do not hand out the word intelligence easily to a fictional organism, but with the eye, I feel it even when I try to be strict. The Maginot notes mentioned earlier, near human measure of problem solving, are consistent with behaviour we witness. It seeks a better host without hesitation. It learns from the body it is in, correcting posture and balance in the sheep. It uses environment. It does not bang blindly at obstacles. And perhaps most damning of all, it seems to understand deception. That iris merge I described earlier buys camouflage. Camouflage is a cognitive tool when deployed situationally. That is not reflex, that is plan. Journalism on the series has also picked up that the eye is especially gross because of its parasitism and control, but embedded in those summaries is an acceptance that it is not just riding a nervous system like a surfer on a wave. It is steering with intent. Intelligence changes the threat profile. A strong parasite is bad. A smart, strong parasite is an extinction-level vector when it can leap hosts in minutes and preserve enough of the prior host's capabilities to use tools. That is the line this creature tiptoes, and it is why I think the show spends time letting us watch it think with its pupils before it moves. Those irises are not only windows, they are gauges, showing us a brain picking a move. Where did it come from and what shaped it? We have a thin breadcrumb trail. The Maginot collected the organism during a long deep space mission and kept it in containment, which it then escaped as the ship's fate devolved. That is canon context. From there, we are in inference territory. My own read is that Trypanohyncha Ocellus evolved in an ecosystem where orbital access was reliable and fast, and where control of the host body granted immediate survival advantages. If that is true, then the prey on its homeworld likely have eyes exposed rather than recessed behind heavy armour plates and social structures that make eye mimicry a high-value trick. If it came from a biosphere rich in atmospheric particulates or sudden light shifts, the multi-iris configuration would be under constant positive selection for handling dynamic exposure without losing contrast edges. Coverage has described the eye as having been part of a 65-year mission specimen haul, which at least tells us it is not a one-off mutation born in a lab accident. It is a stable species, adapted for conquest by interface. A more unsettling possibility is artificial shaping. When a creature is perfectly optimized for a specific point of entry and a specific control pathway, I have to at least entertain the idea that something guided its evolution, if only by inadvertently selecting for individuals that were better at beating containment. We do not have proof of that in the text of the show, but it would explain why the eye seems overfit for our own orbital anatomy. It is either convergent evolution across light years or a parasite with a shockingly broad host acceptance matrix. How the eye sees while it puppets you. I have spent a lot of time thinking about what sight must be like from inside the eye once it is in the socket. It is not reattaching to your retina, it is using its own. That means it has to map its visual field onto your brain's expectations. The human visual cortex expects input from a single lens eye with particular distortion characteristics, a blind spot from the optic disc, and binocular cues that arise from two forward-facing eyes set at a fixed separation. The eye has to spoof all of that. Here is how I think it does it. First, the eye likely produces a retinotopic map that matches the hosts. If its multiple irises each feed a partition of its retina, it can fuse those partitions into a synthetic field with a software-like transform that lines up with the optic nerve's axonal projection pattern. Second, it can devote one iris as the binocular mate and algorithmically fake parallax by combining microcircadian cascades with predictive motion. When the host moves the head, the eye can inject slightly offset visual updates to simulate stereopsis. The brain is tolerant, as long as motion parallax, focus shift, and edge continuity align within a narrow tolerance. The cortex will buy the illusion. Third, because the eye's retina is its own, it can work in spectra the host never had access to. If it sees into near-infrared, for example, it can detect heat gradients in a corridor. It can then translate that into a visible light overlay, so the host's motor planning areas feel the correct urge to turn left where the warmth spikes. Nothing on screen confirms IR or UV sensitivity, to be clear, but the behavior is consistent with an organism that navigates seamlessly through smoke, flicker, and poor lighting. And the multi-aperture setup would be a strong foundation for that. There is a fourth element, and it is unnervingly intimate. Eye contact in social primates like us is not just a visual signal. It is a regulator of interaction. The eye, by being literally in the place where we expect humanity to look back at us, hijacks the reciprocity loop. When a crewmate looks at the possessed host, the eye can widen its dominant pupil in surprise, constrict to imitate focus, or hold an unblinking stare to intimidate. That is not a sensory trick. That is theatre, weaponized at the speed of a blink. The psychology of revulsion by design. The series creators have been open about designing to function first and letting horror emerge from that. Noah Hawley, talking about new creatures, framed the eye's conceit around maximum revulsion. The show taps the same taboo space that made the facehugger iconic. The mouth invasion made us gag. The eye invasion makes our scalp crawl because so many of us have a near instinctive aversion to ocular harm. That is evolutionary. The eye is fragile and high value. Threats to it feel like threats to the self. Alien Earth milks that expertly. It keeps the camera tight on irises and lids. It lets us see tendrils reach for the socket. It gives us just enough time to squirm before the sound design seals the scene. When I read interviews and coverage, I see that design ethos confirmed. The eye exists to deliver a function the franchise had not delivered before, and then to layer intelligence on top of it, so it does not burn out as a one-note gag. What it wants and what it does not do. Does the eye want to coexist with a host while quietly parasitizing it, or is it a devour and move on creature? We do not have a reproductive cycle laid out on screen, and I will not invent one, but its behavior hints that it wants to keep the host as intact as possible for as long as useful. It does not chew through skulls or rupture arteries unless obstructed. It prefers clean insertion and efficient movement. That means it wants you ambulatory. It wants your hands, your badges, your friends' trust. It does not want your blood on the floor unless your blood is an obstacle and not a resource. The other thing it does not seem eager to do is fight xenomorphs as a priority. I have seen spirited commentary about whether it would challenge a xeno, or whether the two species even acknowledge each other strategically. The show has certainly packed more than one nightmare into the Maginot's cargo hold, and editors have referred to a mini-alien movie inside episode 5 to capture that intensity. But in the eye's case, its objectives look orthogonal to a xeno's. A xenomorph wants you dead or cocooned. The eye wants you driven. The fact that they are different kinds of terrible is part of the point. The ethics of recognizing a stolen body. A paragraph on ethics, because the eye attacks the border of personhood. When a parasite sits in someone's socket and puppets them, what are you looking at? The human is still there, co-opted and overridden. Does that create an obligation to save the host, even if the fastest neutralization is a shot to the head? The series does not sermonize, but it does force the question by giving us faces we care about, and then letting the eye sit in those faces like jewelry from hell. I will be frank, in a live crisis, I would subjugate that ethical debate to immediate containment, but in the aftermath, I would want protocols and rituals that acknowledge the host as a victim, not just a vessel. That matters for how crews survive in the long term, not just physically, but psychologically. If you do not build meaning after an eye incident, it will hollow your team out from the inside. Why I think it will get worse. I keep a small notebook of if I were writing this predictions. Here is the one for the eye. The day it stops needing the socket is the day it becomes an epidemic. Right now, it uses the orbit for plug and play, but if it learns to insert through the nasal cavity into the brain or through the ear, it will render visors and goggles obsolete. The multiple irises we see could become sensory probes rather than pupils, and then we are looking at something closer to a sentient endoscope with a locomotive package. I hope I am wrong. I do not want to see it blooming inside a sinus on screen, but the show has already teased us with what is the most revolting function we can design for. If the answer escalates, the eye has room to grow. Another vector for escalation is multi-host coordination. If the eye's problem solving is near human, then two eyes with radio-like bioluminescent signaling or even chemical signals could execute pincer movements in tight corridors or create ambushes at choke points. The iris clusters would make excellent transmitters. A quick 3-blink pattern in near-infrared could communicate left flank blocked, circle right. Again, this is me speculating from what the anatomy seems optimized to do. It is the move I would make if I were evolving this terror. The small moment I cannot forget. There is a shot, short and almost throwaway, where the eye sits in its host's orbit and just looks. The host's head tilts half a degree. The dominant iris narrows. The smaller pupils quiver in the periphery like a choir of tiny scouts. For 1 second, the creature is not lunging or stabbing. It is listening to the light. That is when I understood that the eye is not a jump scare. It is a surveillance state with tendrils. It gathers, it plans, it wears your face long enough to get what it needs and then it goes. That moment will haunt me longer than the gore, and the series serves a lot of gore. Critics are already asking if this is the goriest television we have ever seen, and the eye is their favourite exhibit, the parasitic eyeball that turns bodies into meat puppets and blood into set dressing. But the horror that lingers for me is the accuracy with which the eye uses vision not only to see, but to be seen as harmless until it is too late. It is horror as design. It is horror as interface. This brings us to the end of the video. If you liked what you see here, drop a sub for us. Be marvellous. Be safe.